Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's my great pleasure to deliver this lecture about mind control, why, what, and how. The mind control, or another alternative word, we usually call it the brain-computer interface, is illustrated in this slide. Here, the intentional human subject is recorded, decoded, and converted to control signal that can be used to control an external computer or a device. Why we would need to do mind control or brain-computer interface? This slide illustrates a snapshot about the clinical needs for brain-computer interface. In the United States alone, there are more than 5 million people who are paralyzed, which includes about 1.6% of US adults. To take a spinal cord injury alone, every year it costs more than $40 billion for the United States. If an individual who is at 25 years old with spinal cord injury, the lifelong cost is going to be close to $5 million for a single individual alone. Now, how many diseases that would need such kind of neurorobotics or rehabilitation and assistance? This slide illustrates a few and the medical conditions. For example, stroke, spinal cord injury are two of the most affected diseases that constitute each about 30% of the paralysis in the population. There is a clinical need for rehabilitation, make the patient independent, and to assist the patient for communications. Now, the mind control or brain-computer interface can be used to assist the physical therapy, could be used as neurorobotic tools, could assist in text or speech prosthesis. Now, if you're going to ask these patients with paralysis, most of them is going to say that they really deserve and want to have independence. Whether this is you are living in a household, in a nursing home, or you want to gain the independence to move around. Now here, this slide illustrates what kind of possible BCI application. And by recording and decoding brain intention, brain-computer interface can be used to replace, restore, enhance, supplement, or improve the motor function, not to mention many other functions. So it is really that such kind of clinical need represent a scientific demand for us to further develop a brain-computer interface or mind control technology and approach. There are various BCI or brain-computer interface technology being developed so far. If we would group them, and a simple way is to group these BCI technique based upon modality of recording technique. So you could consider that invasive BCI are those using these intracortical electro array, or could be a epicortical subdural electro array. These are all invasive BCI. Or alternatively, you can put electrode over the scalp using non-invasive sensors to record an EEG. That will be non-invasive BCI. Now, the brain-computer interface, if we will focus on non-invasive BCI, through decoding user intent in real time, BCIs bypass traditional neuromuscular pathway to provide alternative routes of communication and action. Now, in this whole approach, clearly that there are many ways. We talk about non-invasive versus invasive, and even among the non-invasive BCI, there are multiple ways. For example, those with P300 or use SSVEP or with slow cortical potential. One of the particular non-invasive BCI approach using EEG is something called sensorimotor rhythm-based BCI, which is illustrated in this slide on the right panel. If a patient has a disruption or disconnect from the brain to the neuromuscular, and there's a disabled dysfunction neuromuscular pathway, but if the patient has a intact cognitive capability, you can imagine movement, although you cannot move your hand or your leg. In this case, with motor imagination, and it has been demonstrated that using EEG electrode put over the scalp, we can record something called sensorimotor rhythm. From there, we can decode and extract the intention of the human subject, and then to use that to control either robotic device, a computer, wheelchair, or drone. And otherwise, you would normally operate this device using the two hands. And in this case, all could be done just by thinking about that. Now, what are these sensorimotor rhythm signals? This slide illustrates a very simple example that if you would imagine moving the left hand or right hand or both hands, in this case, you can see these topography over the scalp illustrate a very clear distinctive feature as what we know called event-related desynchronization or event-related synchronization associated with their motor imagination. So we will call such kind of motor imagination process motor imagery. And we're going to demonstrate that what such kind of motor imagery is going to generate signals inside our brain and how it could be used to control a computer or device non-invasively. So the first experiment in my lab actually started more than 10 years ago. In this particular work, we look into neuroscience mechanism or a region, neurophysiological region of the signals that is behind the motor imaginary or motor imagination generated EEG. So we conducted a human experimentation in a group of 13 human subjects with such kind of task and design. And we use both functional MRI and imaging. And through the general linear model analysis, we obtain the functional MRI activation mapping. We also record EEG and mainly focus on alpha band and beta band. And by band pass filtering and we perform the source imaging, we obtain the EEG power distribution and also the distribution of change of the EEG signals. So from there, we study what kind of the neurophysiology happening is associated with the motor imagery. This slide illustrates one of the major results. This is a group result from these 13 human subjects. On the right panel are when human subject perform the movement of right hand. So actually the subject, in this case, is moving the right hand. And then you can see here is on the left motor cortex, this red arrow, and show there is a clear bold activation associated with the movement of the right hand. This is well consistent with known physiology and information. Now, if you are going to perform the imaginary of right hand, so the hand is still, you are not moving, but you are thinking to move your right hand. In this case, what we can see is there's also contralateral bold signal elevation, although the signal is much more focused compared with the actual movement. So this is our fMRI finding. What about EEG? So we perform EEG source imaging from beta region. In this case, you can see similarly in the contralateral and the motor cortex, it's a fairly more broad compared with fMRI due to the well-known and volume conduction challenge. And same thing that if we're imagining moving right hand, we get similarly contralateral and the EEG source signal. Now, what is the difference compared with the both signal is while the contralateral both elevation is accompanying with both movement and imagined movement of right hand, the beta rhythm EEG source imaging illustrates decrease in EEG power, but co-localized with the fMRI. If we look at the alpha band, similarly co-localization occur, and which actually provide a better localization compared with beta rhythm. Now we not only looking into imagine the right hand movement, we're also looking into imagine the left hand movement and imagine foot movement. And this slide shows the comparison between both fMRI signal, which is shown on the top row, and the EEG beta source imaging and shown on the bottom row. You can see at what we discussed that this contralateral both elevation associated with imagining the right hand movement. If we would imagine moving left hand, the right motor cortex is going to illustrate both elevation. And similarly, imagine the foot and activation is going to show the both elevation in the motor cortex corresponding to its manifestation of the foot. And similarly, co-localization of the EEG source imaging is observed with the one exception that while the both elevation is observed, EEG power is decreasing, which is effectively representing ERD or even related desynchronization associated with the motor imagery. So if we will look at the maximum activity, and in this case, for the right hand, imagined movement on the top or actual movement on the bottom, you can see that there's the both and the peak, beta peak or alpha peak, they all co-localized well. If you're going to look at the left hand, similarly, there's a good co-localization of the maximum activity in both fMRI signal and in EEG beta rhythm or alpha rhythm source imaging result. So, we have discussed this neurophysiological region of sensorimotor rhythm-based BCI. And let's revisit the BCI. The BCI or brain-computer interface essentially is the decoding of movement, attention, intention, or other cognitive-related tasks to control an external device, be it a computer or a physical machination. And this is something that I put it down long time ago, 16 years ago, in the first neuroengineering textbook that I edited. And as the next, I would like to show you that one of the work we conducted in my lab is to how we move from virtual helicopter control to the actual drone control to robotic arm control. An effort which we have pursued over the past decade. So before this virtual helicopter control, most of these EEG sensorimotor rhythm-based BCI were directed at the cursor movement. So you have a computer cursor moving to the left or right, up or down. It's a cursor movement. So we wanted to ask a question whether we are able to perform continuous control, not have a center out, not say always starting from one point, have cursor going out from the center point. We want to have something more engaging. So in this experiment, what we designed is a virtual campus of University of Minnesota where I was on faculty, and a virtual helicopter and virtual building. and we have a virtual ring, and we basically ask a subject to control the flight of this virtual helicopter to go through the virtual ring in this virtual campus. Here is one comparison between the BCI control on the left panel versus the keyboard control. Essentially, this is starting from a specific point and go to the various endpoint. So there is many trials, and then we average that for all the trials that we collected in a group of human subjects, and we found a high degree of consistency between the BCI control, where people using the mind to control the flight of the helicopter, virtual helicopter, versus if you are going to use a keyboard to fly this virtual helicopter. So here let's look at an example of the video, which was recorded about 10 years ago. So as what we discussed, this small red guy is a virtual helicopter, and is exploring the virtual campus of the university and try to find a virtual ring and then try to navigate, go through this particular ring without hitting the edge. So such kind of activity, essentially subject is constantly performing motor imagination to generate a control signal. After this experiment, we ask a question that, are we able to actually control a physical drone, not a virtual drone? So in this experiment, and once again, it was performed at University of Minnesota, where I was on faculty together with my student. What we are doing here, you can see, is we have this drone through the Wi-Fi connection. The subject wearing an EEG cap, he can see the drone, but he is not moving any part of his body. By imagining moving the left hand, the right hand, both hands, or none of them, he is generating control signal to fly this drone. There is a constant forward-going velocity, so that if you want to turn to the left, you imagine moving left. If you want to turn right, you imagine and right hand. If you want to lift up, imagine moving both hands. If you want to bring it down, you imagine moving none of the two hands. So this is essentially is the experiment we did demonstrate for the first time that human subject is able to fly a drone in 3D space just by thinking about that from entirely non-invasive EEG recordings. After this project, we keep pursuing and ask the next question, that is, are we able to have human subject control the moving of a robotic arm, such as illustrated in this slide on the left panel, that you have this Lego put on the desk? And are you able to control robotic arm, reach to a selected target, grab that target, and bring it to somewhere else, such as a shelf on the right-hand side, on the right panel in this slide? So we have conducted this experiment in about a dozen human subjects. On the left panel here illustrate is 6 subjects, the trajectory that it different color illustrate different human subject. Basically, you can see it's randomly placed the target subject control entirely using their mind to grab, navigate, reach at the target and grab it and then put it onto the shelf. The right panel here showing about 2,000 trials in this group of human subjects. The green circle illustrates success trial, and the yellow cross illustrates abort. That means after several minutes, still the subject was not able to accomplish the goal. So it's essentially represented failure. So you can see fairly well that about actual statistics also show about 80% of trials were successful by this group of human subjects. Let's look at this video again. And this is a recording now illustrating one human subject and is entirely using the mind to control the movement of the robotic arm to grab a Lego and then bring this Lego onto one location over the bookshelf. And we're monitoring EMG to ensure that the hand movement is not there, so it's entirely motor imagery based, the BCI control. So we here illustrate that there are 4 human subjects and they're performing similar tasks. The right lower corner is the visual guide we provided initially to the human subject, so to help them to pick up this skill for robotic arm control. And after this experiment, and we did look into the question that whether such kind of cursor visual guide, how big effect it's going to be. So in this experiment, you can see the dark green are showing the group of about dozen human subjects with visual aid. Then we select 6 subjects of them to recruit them to perform 2 experiments. One is the experiment still with the cursor visual aid. Another is without a visual aid. So the light green showing the 6 subjects with visual aid, the gray bar showing that without a visual aid. And you can see the PVC or the accuracy metric for the 4 target actually is not decreased if you take away the visual aid. And for 5 target, there's a slight decrease in performance if you take away the visual aid. Now in terms of number of blocks within certain limited time, the green bar showing the maximum a subject can accomplish, you can see that there is no statistically significant difference between with visual aid or without visual aid, just to show that the visual aid is not most critical factor for the human subject to learn to control a robotic arm control. All right, let's come back to the EEG signals. So far, we have been using scalpel-recorded EEG signal to do the decoding and controlling a quadcopter or a robotic arm. Now, we all know there is a so-called volume conduction problem, that if you have a source, a cortical source is illustrated here, and that's going to diffusely spread out. And if it starts from different location, if you go to scalp, it's going to get quite a smear, as shown on the right panel of this slide, that even though the cortical source is quite distinctive, it's hard to observe such kind of distinctive localization from scalp EEG recording. So we have pursued an approach which I called electrophysiological source imaging, or EEG or ESI. Essentially is from EEG or MEG recording. For the BCI approach, we use EEG. And then we use MRI to provide anatomical constraint, and we solve the source imaging problem to obtain high resolution source distribution inside the brain. And this approach is able to effectively counter the volume conduction effect. So as early as 2004, and my lab was the first to publish a peer-reviewed journal article to suggest the feasibility to apply the source imaging to the decoding of sensorimotor rhythm BCI. Here we use offline data. It's people doing offline motor imagination, as what we discussed, either the left hand imagination or right hand imagination. And here these are cortical and source imaging result in 5 human subjects illustrate that if you're imagining moving the right hand, you see such kind of activation on the left and hemisphere. And the other 5 subjects is that if you have left hand movement imagination, you see right hemisphere and cortical activation. And furthermore, we have pursuing a number of research along this line. And 5 years ago, my former PhD student, Brad Edelman, performed an experiment. In this case, he conducted experiment with much more complex and action, including not just the left versus right hand, but the flexion, extension, supination, and pronation, a very complicated hand gesture and movement. And what you can see in this animation, a different color coding 4 different kind of action, you can see various cortical source distribution is obtained and from such kind of complicated and hand movement imagination. The right panel illustrates a comparison. If we do the decoding from the scalp EEG alone, or which is a gray bar, or if you solve the source imaging and then do the decoding, which is a blue bar, it illustrates that consistently improved performance if using source imaging signal to do the BCI control. So along this line, and we develop an online system, and with the aid of the MRI, structure MRI, and we perform the source imaging, and then we designate considering anatomical and constraint, and to find a region of interest and derive the source signals. Eventually, we perform decoding on such kind of source signals to control a cursor or robotic arm. So in this work published 2 years ago, and in this case, we performed a various experimentation. We look at 2 things. And what we discussed, there's for the brain-computer interface, there's a brain aspect and there's a computer aspect. So in the brain aspect, we look into the effect of training. We performed, actually, to our knowledge, the first investigation on continuous pursuit and the task in the EEG-based BCI versus generally center out the discrete and the event. And we look at the background and baseline recording. We perform training, and then we evaluate them. We basically investigate all the combinations in the hope that we want to find out what is the most critical factors in terms of brain aspect. In the machine aspect, in this case, is we leverage on the source imaging based approach. So we perform source imaging, and then we apply the same decoding algorithm to get the control. Finally, in a group of 6 human subjects, and we directly demonstrate and testing the capability of the source imaging based and the mind control of a robotic arm. So here are some detailed results. I'm not going to spend time talk about all these figures, and if anyone interested, you could go to our Science Robotics paper published 2 years ago. And one message I want to mention, that what we discovered is that training in complicated tasks actually significantly help the subject if compared with the subject is going to be trained in the simplified task. So if you're training subject with a continuous pursuit, which is much more sophisticated, if you are going to evaluate a subject in simplified task, which is discrete, there's a 60% improvement of performance. If you're going to test in continuous pursuit evaluation, then there's a 500% improvement in the performance, indicating that complicated task training plays a very significant role. So here, let's look at this video. First is a 2-dimensional continuous cursor control. So the big ball is generated by computer with a random movement, and then this circle is illustrating the position controlled by the human subject just purely by motor imagination, and then with the EEG recording and source imaging decoding, and then we illustrate how a continuous 2-dimensional and a virtual object control can be accomplished by this and the BCI system. After that, we look at directly in human subject to control a continuous movement of robotic arm. In this case, a similar technique was applied with the EEG source decoding. You can see that the ball is moving randomly, except that it does not, there's a physical constraint. If you hit on the left bar edge, it will just bounce back, not go to the other way. And the human subject is just purely by motor imagination to control the continuous movement of the robotic arm, which to our knowledge is the first time to realization of continuous robotic arm control using non-invasive EEG-based BCI. So with here, the next, before my ending, I would like to touch on some interesting exploration that we perform in our lab. That is to look into mind modulation versus mind control. And what we know, the mindful meditation or yoga has been widely practiced as a health-enhancing practice. In here, basically, you are modulating your mind. And the BCI control is a mind control, as what we already discussed. Now, based upon the motor imaginary-based BCI, and we say you can move, just by thinking of the moving of your hand, you can control the cursor movement or even robotic arm movement. Now, such kind of BCI certainly has a benefit that it's non-invasive, it's intuitive, and it's a continuous control. At the same time, it has a limitation that one of the major limitations is long training times needed. And there's a variable user skill in the sense that if you're going to study 10 subjects and their skill set among these 10 subjects could be widely distributed. Finally, that there could be 15 to 20% human subject was considered inefficient in a sense. Even after training, they may not pick up these BCI skills and well. So we look into this problem, and this slide illustrates the comparison of the brain region active engagement between the feedback learning that is required in the BCI control and versus that what has been known that what brain regions are actively and contributing to being active during the mindful meditation. You can see there's a fairly reasonable overlap between these two sets of the cortical regions. So because of that, we've been looking into this issue, and my lab, and also there's a publication actually happened to be in the same year. We learned after we published. So we look into this essential long-term meditation or yoga effect on the BCI. And this slide illustrates the study design. We look into 36 human subjects with 12 subjects of 1 year or longer meditation experience, and 24 subjects effectively has very little experience so far. We recruit them to undergoing 3 sessions BCI control. It control the cursor to the left or right, and then up or down, identical. And then what we do is we want to see how many subjects is going to survive. Only subject can accomplish 80% or better performance, they will be allowed to advance to the next phase. Here you can see that in the first experiment, the left and right cursor control, 100% of meditation subject was able to pass, and only about slightly above 40% of the control subject was able to do. Now the next, after left and right control, we train subject for the up and down, which mainly representing the full 1D control. You can see interestingly that about 2/3 of meditation subjects were able to complete, and only 1/3 of the control subjects were able to complete. So this experiment suggests that long-term meditation exercise were able to improve the early BCI learning. The next question we ask is, what about short-term meditation? That is, what about if someone never done meditation or yoga? Are we able to recruit them and train them with short-term meditation training, and then could help these subjects to pick up the BCI skill or enhance their BCI skill? So in this experiment, what we do is we recruit all the subjects, do a baseline BCI experiment, and then we randomly assign half of the subject to go for a 8 weeks meditation training course, the other half is being put in the waiting list. After 8 weeks, we bring everybody back and then go through another 6 to 10 sessions of BCI evaluation experiment. Now, what kind of the meditation training would be suitable? Here, what we did is we chose a mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, training course. It is a fairly well established in at least the United States, according to the founder of this MBSR. The mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So we train these meditation subjects through 8 weeks MBSR and training course, and then we brought everyone back for evaluation experimentation. And here, once again, and after the experimentation, and sorry for the too fast advancing. And this slide illustrates the main result. First of all, we did a breath counting on all the subjects. Our results found that there is statistically significant and change in the meditation subject before or after the meditation. And the breath counting is different. And after meditation process, we found this statistically significant difference between the meditation subject versus control subject, which provide a behavior data supporting our BCI finding. In the middle panel illustrate their BCI performance group average along each of the training their evaluation session as normalized to the baseline. You can see the pink color illustrate their meditation group, and light blue color illustrates control. So there is a consistent and the difference between the meditation group versus the control group, and even along the line of this learning. On the right-hand side, the panel illustrates that there is statistically significant difference in terms of the up-down control or 2D control that the meditation subject performed significantly better than the control group. But there is better, although not statistically better, significantly better for the left or right control. The next, we look into electrophysiological signals of these subjects. We want to understand what causes such kind of change or difference. So in this particular slide, illustrate that we particularly pay attention on the up-down, the cursor movement, and we examine the alpha power contrast between motor imaginary and the rest. So rest means you imagining nothing. You're just being very calm. And versus you are trying to bring up the cursor, which is the movement of the both hands. And on the top of the control group illustrates some very popular, well-established pattern for such kind of motor imaginary. The second row illustrates for meditation group subject, which show a totally different spatial topography of such kind of alpha power contrast. So we look at the average of the entire group. On the panel B, you can see the control group, very standard, and the MBSR group, which you see that this is a lot of electrode and show a high alpha power and contrast, as you can see in this group difference. Finally, we perform source imaging of the data. We found such kind of alpha power contrast actually are widely spread out over the cortex at a group level, which is showing that with the mindful meditation training, the meditation subject group develop such kind of different electrophysiological signature, which may explain why that there's significantly better BCI control performance. So let's look back at this brain-computer interface. We know that this brain, this computer or the external device. We discussed already the MBSR or meditation training can be used to improve BCI performance, which is a brain science contribution to BCI. Next question is, what about the computer? How do we use a computer to improve BCI performance? So first of all, I want to mention there are numerous research labs in the world at this time. That is, there's people working on advancing various algorithms. classification algorithm, decoding algorithm. So there are lots of these work out there. What I'm referring to here is our specific approach in our lab that we use deep learning to look into this issue. So deep learning with artificial neural networks has performed well on BCI classification task. The right panel is taken from a review paper published 2 years ago. In this case, that there are lots of these deep learning based work has been reported, but with the limitation that they tested in small data set and trials based and classification and focus only on motor cortex, not the entire scalp. Our data set in this case represent, to our knowledge, is the largest somatosensory reason-based BCI. It's a continuous 2D classification, and we're also looking into the motor cortex in the sense that electrode covering the motor cortex compared with the whole scalp coverage. So we adopt a artificial neural network deep learning architecture published 4 years ago and by Schermester and co-workers. In this particular network, and the temporal convolution and spatial filter were used. So you can see that we use a 500 millisecond in terms of temporal length, and with a distance between each of these frames is 40 millisecond. And then we look at using 10 motor cortex channel or versus the entire and scalp coverage, which is 62 channel. And with that, the output of this deep learning network is a 4 state, which is either right hand, left hand, both hand, or rest. So with that, this slide illustrates the result. Of course, this is the offline experiment. We compare with online and the result, which is a gray bar illustrated here. And the pink color illustrates that if we use a deep learning and we use 10 electrodes covering the motor cortex, the light blue color illustrates the deep learning result if we're using all the 62 electrodes. So there's 2 messages. First, the deep learning based algorithm outperform online performance in this offline investigation. 2 is if we will use the whole scalp coverage, actually the performance is even better than if we're only using electrodes covering the motor cortex. So another result that we have learned is we look at the difference and for the left-right control, up-down control, and 2D control, and what we found. And once again, the color illustrate and the gray color show the online result, the pink color showing the 10 electromotor cortex covering electrode, and blue color illustrate the entire cortex coverage. So what we found is that if we are using all the electrode covering entire cortex, we found that there is statistically significant improvement in performance by using deep learning, in this case convolution network. And for the motor model, which is using 10 electrodes covering the motor cortex alone, is providing statistically significant better result in left or right or up or down the 1D control. It does not provide significantly improved result in 2D control. So this is the result that we got. I want to take this opportunity to share with the scientific community that we have made our EEG BCI database public. The database contains 62 human subjects with 62 channel EEG recording for about 600 hours. And including meditation subject and control subject, there's 1-dimensional continuous cursor control and 2-dimensional continuous cursor control. In each subject, there's 7 to 11 BCI sessions. The results were uploaded to figureshare.org and the public repository, and over the past 7 months or so, there were close to 30,000 downloads already. So everybody is welcome to access this resource, and we hope to assist other investigators by publicizing our 5 years work on this data collection. So in conclusion, brain-computer interface or mind control provides alternative channels for communications or action control. EEG-based sensorimotor reason brain-computer interface allows non-invasive decoding of the mind and controlling of robotics or device. The mindfulness improves sensorimotor reason BCI performance by increasing control of neural activity in the alpha band. And finally, we show preliminary results that deep learning improves the BCI classification accuracy. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the contribution of a number of colleagues. On the left side are my current and a former student or postdoc. They have contributed to the work I'm presenting today, and the faculty collaborators on the right side. And finally, I want to acknowledge every one of the key lab and over the past 14 years that we have conducted numerous BCI experimentation, including many even undergraduate students who may not, made up the co-authorship of some publications, but they all contributed to various experimentation. And also I want to acknowledge NIH and NSF for the funding support throughout the past decade that contributing to the results that I'm presenting here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions if any.